silence. When I think about silence, I think about when I was in college, and I was a grad student, and I had a office mate, and this office mate weighed over 500 pounds. He was a big guy, very verbose, very loud. And so we went out to eat one night at Victoria Station. And I don't know if you remember those, but they were sort of had a railroad theme to them in those days, and a pretty good little steakhouse. So we went to eat there, and they actually had a live band that night. And it happened to be the band that had written and recorded the song Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer. And I think that was like, they were a one-hit wonder. It was the only song that ever had done anything for them. But they were playing that night, and they had played song after song and song. And of course, we were there trying to talk to each other, and it was impossible, right? I mean, it was so loud and trying to talk. And then at the end of one song, the lead singer basically said, "Does anybody have a request?" And it was loud. "Does anybody have a request?" And my office mate sitting there, I think he was trying to do it for the people kind of in the immediate area, just to show how clever he was. And he went, "Silence." Well, about the time he did that, everything, all the volume just dropped to nothing at that time. And that's all you heard was silence. So the guy said, "Do y'all have a request?" And he said, "Silence." And it was awkward. It was embarrassing. But there is a time when silence is good. At that point in time, that silence was not good, and it was awkward, and it was bad. But silence should be a part of our repertoire, and we should know when to be silent, when to speak. And here's some from Proverbs, as well as some modern quotes in Proverbs. And Proverbs 17:28 says, "Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise. And he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding." Now, there is a famous quote that is often attributed to Abe Lincoln, and it is better to be silent and to be considered a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. Now, actually, when I researched this, we talked about this when we were actually in Proverbs 17. Sometimes that quote is attributed to Mark Twain, sometimes Abe Lincoln, and they really don't know exactly who first came out with that quote. But I don't think it matters a whole lot, because I believe it's really just a modern restating of Proverbs 17:28. It's the same theme, is that, hey, you can be considered wise, but once you open your mouth, you're subject to whatever you said there. So there is a time to be silent. Here's one that says, "Wisdom is made up of 10 parts, 9 of which are silence. The 10th brevity." So be silent. If you are going to speak, be quick, be brief. You must speak up to be heard, but sometimes you have to shut up to be appreciated. Silence is the voice of the convinced. Loudness is the voice of those who want to convince themselves. And then Calvin Coolidge says, "If you don't say anything, you won't be called on to repeat it." And Proverbs 6 talks about the ant, and actually Ben Franklin said, "None preached better than the ant," and she says nothing. Remember, Proverbs 6 says, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise." The ant doesn't say anything, but we consider the ant to be wise. If you keep your mouth shut, you won't put your foot in it. No one has ever repented of having held his tongue. And if there's a substitute for brains, it has to be silence. And finally, this is an Arabic proverb. We don't often hear of Arabic proverbs. It says, "Open your mouth only if what you are going to say is more beautiful than silence." And there is a time when silence can be very, very beautiful. All right, so let's go to verse 17, Proverbs 25. It says, "Withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee, and so hate thee." This is saying, don't wear out your welcome. You can stay too long, and you're going to wear out your welcome with your neighbor. It is expected that neighbors would visit neighbors, but such hospitality should not be abused. Have you ever had somebody come over and visit, and you're like, when are they going to leave? That's what this is talking about. Be considerate of your neighbor. Know that there's a time to be there and there's a time to leave. The wise man or woman will be sensitive to the sense that a neighbor may become weary of their presence. Since good neighborly relationships make life better, this is an important principle of wisdom. You know, Ben Franklin said, guests, like fish, begin to smell after 3 days. And then here's a quote by John Walke. He said, friendship ripens through discreet sensitivity, not to intrude on privacy and to allow space to be a person in his own right, not through self-enjoyment, impetuosity, or imposition. Without that discretion, instead of enriching life, friendship takes away from it. Now, I tried to embed a video here, but I don't think it's going to work. But you probably know this scene if you've ever seen Christmas Vacation with Chevy Chase and Randy Quaid. And basically, when they get there, he's telling him, Cousin Eddie is saying, Clark, that's an RV out there. It's just this ratty old RV. And he tells him, he says, now, Clark, don't you be falling in love with that RV because we're going to take it with us when we leave next month. And Clark just spits out his eggnog like, next month? You're staying until next month? So they didn't know that they were being scriptural there, but there is a time to come and there's a time to go. I remember another time when Ruth and I were in College Station, and I worked with a guy. He was a little bit weird, but he had invited us to dinner. And he said, hey, look, I want you to come over to dinner. My wife's going to fix a meal. We want to get to know you guys, and so on and so forth. And Ruth and I, we didn't know too many people in town, so we said, sure, yeah, that sounds good. So we went over there, and when we arrived, I mean within 10 seconds, it became real clear that Chris had not done a good job up front of getting this approved, cleared with the wife. She was not on the same page in terms of fixing a meal. We rarely saw her. They were back in the back room, gibbering and jabbering, and it was not pretty. It was not happy. And finally, Chris came out with a couple of Oreos and some milk. We had Oreos and milk. I think we were gone within like 10 minutes. And it was real clear that we were not welcome there. So sometimes your welcome can be worn out real quickly. So we were looking for a way to get out the door. So this verse is talking about with your neighbor, be considerate, understand that there's a time when you can wear out your welcome, and always put your neighbor first. And then verses 18 and 19, this is continuing to talk about a neighbor and our relationship with our neighbors. And it says, a man that beareth false witness against his neighbor is a maul or a club and a sword and a sharp arrow. These are all weapons of war. So if you bear false witness against your neighbor, it's like coming after him with weapons of war. Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a broken tooth or a foot out of joint. So many proverbs speak against the man who bears false witness. Now, this false witness, it could be in a court of law kind of a situation. It could just be amongst other neighbors and so forth. But we are warned many times in the Bible against bearing false witness. It's even part of the 10 Commandments. Not to bear false witness. It can do great damage. You can be like a club, like a sword, like a sharp arrow if you bear false witness. Matthew Poole said, this man who bears false witness is as cruel and pernicious to him as any instrument of death. The design of the proverb is to show the wickedness of slander and that a false witness is in some respects as bad as a murderer. Now, Bruce Waltke had an interesting take on this verse that I certainly would not have seen, but he describes how that in battle, the club or the maul is when you're very close, face to face. That's the weapon that you use. And that a sword has a little more distance to it, and an arrow has even greater distance to it. And that you can, with slander, you can damage the relationship. You can hurt someone, whether it be up close or a little further away or a little further away. These weapons are for different situations, and all of them can be wounding. Charles Bridges says, the tongue wounds 4 people at one stroke. The person harms himself, the object of his attack, anyone who listens to his word, and the name of God. Flee from this deadly disease. So I thought that was pretty clever. He says, you're really affecting 4 people when you slander someone, when you have false witness. It's not just the person you're attacking, it's 4 different people that are affected. Be very, very careful. And then it says it's like a broken tooth and a foot out of joint. And I don't know if you've ever had a broken tooth, but often when you break a tooth, there's a nerve exposed, and you just can't wait to get to the dentist. I mean, you want to go get that thing fixed because it's painful. And a foot out of joint, you want to get to the emergency room, you want to get it set, or if it's just sprain, you want to get it isolated. So this being a false witness, being unfaithful to a neighbor is just like them having a broken tooth or a foot out of joint. It's painful. And then verse 20 says, as he that taketh away a garment in cold weather. So I thought about February of 2021. Do y'all remember February of 2021, how cold it was? It got to 2 below at our house. We lost electricity for 4 days. I said before, it was almost like the Lord of the Flies there by day 4. We were thinking, which one of us is going to eat the other one? But it was really, it gets really brutal when you lose electricity, when you lose power and it's cold. We were able to keep the house at about 49 degrees with a fireplace and with a generator and a little heater at night. We could keep it at about 49. And I can tell you, we dressed in several layers of clothes and had lots of blankets on top of us at night. And so this is saying, it's like taking away a garment is one of the ways it sets this verse up. And then it says, and as vinegar upon nitre. Now, I've told you before that when I was in Wyoming, I was working with a company that was actually mining trona. And trona is sodium carbonate. And this word nitre is also kind of short for natron, and that is sodium carbonate. And it's basically saying taking vinegar and sodium carbonate and mixing them together. Now, if you ever had a chemistry class or you ever just tried that at some point in time, taking vinegar and acid and taking sodium carbonate, a base, and mixing them together, you get all kind of fizz and explosion, and it's kind of a lot of fun. But it says it's like taking a garment away when someone's cold, or it's like pouring acid on a base. So is he that singeth songs to an heavy heart. It's kind of interesting. So it's saying, hey, someone that's got a heavy heart, someone that's brokenhearted, or someone that's really down, or maybe life is taken over, they're overwhelmed. It's not right to come up and just be, bubbly joyous in front of them. They're not going to take it really well. It's the verse is saying, don't be clueless. Be sensitive to what someone's feeling. Try to meet their needs and what they're feeling, as opposed to trying to sing them some big, bubbly, happy song. Be very cognizant of where people are and respond appropriately. Some people in their actions are especially troublesome. They bring discomfort, like leaving one without a garment in cold weather, or constant agitation, like vinegar on soda. The one who treats the heavy heart without sensitivity brings discomfort and the irritation of agitation. If songs are sung to a heavy heart, they should be sung in a minor key. I thought that was kind of a clever statement. There are times when when you're really feeling down, if somebody just bubbly around you, that can be irritating sometimes. And G. Campbell Morgan said, the proverb indicates the impropriety of making merry in the presence of sorrow. It is wrong in method and serves to increase distress rather than to soothe it. And of course, our goal should be to help soothe someone when they're in that kind of a state. And I like the way they say it here, a heavy heart. We all kind of know what that feels like, a heavy heart. Verse 21 is a verse that we've heard many times, and it's even quoted in the New Testament. It says, if thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee. Now, this is opposite of our normal thinking. We don't think about having an enemy and making sure that they have plenty to eat and making sure that they have plenty to drink. But this says, hey, if you have an enemy, make sure that they're taken care of. The Bible tells us to love each other. It tells us to love our enemies. So the Bible commands us to show love and care even to our enemy. Human nature would tell us to hate our enemy, but the Bible tells us to love them and to do it practically, in a practical manner, something that means something, like giving them something to eat. And Paul quoted in Romans 12, 9-21, there's a long passage that talks about how that we are to treat others. And verse 20 actually quotes this verse. Now, so this phrase, for thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, there's kind of a debate on exactly what does that mean, heaping coals of fire on their head. And the debate is that a good thing or a harsh thing? Well, it sounds like a harsh thing, right? Putting coals on top of someone's head sounds very harsh. And I think very well that could be the meaning. Most likely it refers to a burning conviction that our kindness places on our enemy. Or some think it refers to the practice of lending coals from a fire to help a neighbor start his or her on, an appreciating act of kindness. Either way, we can destroy our enemy by making him our friend. So I think that's what the verse is saying. Hey, turn them into your friend as opposed to your enemy by doing these kind things. So either way, we destroy our enemy by making him a friend, and the Lord will reward you. Most commentators agree with Augustine and Jerome that the coals of fire referred to the burning pangs of shame which a man will feel when good is returned for evil, his shame producing remorse and contrition. If someone is an enemy and they're coming at you aggressively, if you return that aggression, it's usually just ratchets up on both sides until it's out of control. I think one of the things this is saying is that you can stop that aggression by doing something they don't expect. Rather than responding in like kind, you do something nice for them and it takes that away. Here's what Meyer said. He said, do you think that others have wronged you? Pity them, pray for them, seek them out, show them their fault humbly and meekly, wash their feet, take the mote out of their eye, seek to restore them in a spirit of meekness, remembering that you may be tempted. Heap coals of loving kindness on their heads, bring them, if possible, into such a broken and tender frame of mind that they may seek forgiveness at your hand and God's. If you cannot
act thus with all your emotion you would feel. Do it because it is right, and the emotion will inevitably follow. That principle of doing what's right and then the emotion following, that very similar to a practice in consulting. Often when I have been working with a client, one of the things that I'm working on is trying to change the way they act, the way they're thinking, and the way they behave. And one kind of a simple example is, many times one of the things that we try to change is the way people hold and conduct meetings, because in most companies, meetings are terribly ineffective, terribly inefficient, just big time wasters. Nobody likes them. So what you have to do is teach them, how do you hold a really good meeting? And it's a fairly complex set of things to do, but one of the approaches that you take is that you take the leader of that meeting, and there's a lot of constructs in terms of showing them, hey, here's an effective meeting and here's how to do it. But then before the first meeting, you sit down with them and you do a little bit of coaching. And then they go, you have them, you don't conduct the meeting for them, but you have them conduct it. And then afterwards, you pull them aside, hey, let's debrief on that meeting, and you coach them again. Hey, you could have done this better, and hey, that was a good thing, you followed that, and so forth. And then you do it another cycle, and after a few cycles, it begins to click. And after a while, they begin to have effective meetings and efficient meetings, and things begin to run really smoothly. And the way we describe that is act your way into a new way of thinking. If you act and do something often enough, it will change the way you think. And that's what Meyer is saying here. It's not going to be natural the first time you go and do kindness for an enemy. You're not going to want to do that. But if you will just do it because it's right, and if you do it often enough, the emotion, the thinking will eventually follow. And sometimes in our life, that's what we have to do, is just do right because we know it's right. And just do right until it becomes just the way that we do things. Verse 23 says, the north wind driveth away rain, so doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue. Many different translations say that that's not talking about the north wind takes rain away, but actually it brings rain in, the way it's describing. And it's basically saying, just as the north wind is going to bring rain, if you have a backbiting tongue, you're going to get an angry countenance in response. You're going to make someone mad. So don't have a backbiting tongue. So just like the north wind brings in the rain, a gossiping tongue leads to an angry countenance. Another verse here that's basically talking about, how do you treat your neighbors? How do you treat those around you? Now here's one where all the men say amen, and then they get in trouble when they get home. It says, it is better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman and in a wide house. And it's not the first time this theme has been in Proverbs. And basically what this means is that we should strive for our homes to be a place of peace. Out in the world, in the workplace, I mean, sometimes it's dog eat dog, and it's stressful, and it's very immediate, time sensitive. Boy, you got to get everything done on time, and you just come away from a work sometime, really stressed out, really, oh my goodness, if I can just get home. Well, that works if your home is a place of peace, where you can come home and all that just kind of melts away. And then you get fired up to do it again the next day. But your home should be a place of peace. Now it talks about it better to dwell in the corner of the house top. Now in those days, they would make houses that had a rooftop that was typically flat, and it was a place where in the hottest part of the day, you could get up on the top of the rooftop and you could get a little bit of breeze up there. And it's saying, hey, it would be better to be in just the very corner of that housetop up there and there's no furniture, there's no nothing. It's just right there in the corner. You'd be better off there than if you were in a huge house, but it was not a house of peace. So we should strive to make our homes homes of peace, not only for each other, but also for our kids, for our grandkids. So let's make that our goal, to have houses that are peaceful. Verse 25 says, as cold waters to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. So when you're weary and you have cold water, it can be very, very refreshing. None of you, except for Ruth and Jake, ever had the chance to meet our daughter, Becky. Becky was so wonderful, so cheerful, so bubbly, but one of her characteristics is she was sensitive. And if I was out mowing or doing yard work, sweating profusely, most of my household would just sit and watch me until I just ground myself into the ground. But Becky, she had a different spirit, and she would fill a glass with water, put some ice in it, and she'd come out here, Dad, you look like you could use some nice cold water. And man, that'd be so refreshing. It'd be so good. And Becky was so good about that. And then later on, we had a teen in the church who often came over and did some work, raking and mowing and so on and so forth. And Becky was the same way with Kevin. She'd see Kevin out there. After a little while, she'd go get him a big old jug of ice water and say, Kevin, you look like you could use some ice water. And he really appreciated that. And just an aside, Kevin is now a pastor in San Antonio, and he's got a church that runs about 2,000 every Sunday morning. So really good kid, but it wouldn't have mattered what kind of guy he was. Becky was going to make sure that there was that refreshing water. And that's what this verse is talking about, is that cold waters to a thirsty soul, how refreshing that is. So is good news from a far country. And I think this good news from a far country, it reminds me of missionaries and the role of a missionary. And I think about it in two different ways. One is that the missionary who goes to the far land and brings the gospel, and people hear it maybe for the first time, and they find Christ, it's so refreshing to their soul. It's like that cold drink of water, but magnified 100 times. It's so beneficial and so appreciated by those people that someone would travel so far to bring them such a wonderful message. And I also think about it in terms of missionaries, in terms of not only them delivering the gospel, but them being able to have connection and contact back with their home country. Now, when I was a kid, I can remember my mom and dad took a trip one time to Mexico. And one of the things we did on that trip to Mexico is we went and visited, I think, 6 different missionary families. And we would go and stay a couple of days. We didn't stay 3. We didn't become the fish. We'd stay a couple of days with those missionary families around in Mexico. And I can just remember getting to meet those missionaries and talk to them and hear their stories and how important that was. And from that, I always, when there is a missionary in the church, I try to talk to them. I try to understand a little bit about what's going on with their ministry. And I can remember when I was young, as a child, that missionaries would talk about how difficult it was to communicate back to their home countries and to their families. This was back in the, say, early 60s. It was expensive to bring your family back to the U.S. And sometimes these missionary families have 3, 4, 5 kids.
They couldn't afford to just jump on a plane anytime they wanted to. It was usually at least 4 years, maybe 6, 8, even 10 years before they could come home and have that communication with their loved ones. And I'm sure that was just like a refreshing, drink of water to be able to be back. And you may not realize it if you're younger. It used to cost money to make a long distance call. I can remember where it used to call, if you wanted to call someone in Europe or somewhere across the pond somewhere, it would be $10, $12, $13 a minute to call somebody. It was expensive. And the same for them. It would, and even more when they were in those countries. So they would actually put a timer up, and they would have everything set up in advance, have it all written down, because they were going to try to do everything in a minute. Because they just didn't have an extra 13. And if you stayed on 5 minutes, you're talking $65. Notice how quick I did that math. That was expensive in order to be able to do that. So they didn't do that. It's different now. I know Jim White, missionary in Germany, it's just part of their long distance plan. It's basically free. They pay like one small long distance rate, and they can call and they can talk as long as they want to anybody in the world. So the way missionaries used to talk to someone was through letters. And they would send that letter, and it would take like a month for that letter to get here. And then if you responded to them, it'd take a month to get back. That was a very slow pace of communication. And if it was really urgent, you could use airmail. So that only took about a week to get over and get back. So I think one of the really great things for missionaries these days is they are able to connect. Social media, they got all kind of ways to connect with people back home that support them, love them, and so forth. And that's a great blessing. So it's getting good news from a far country, whether you be someone going to a far country and delivering the message, the gospel, or whether or not you are looking to talk to someone from home. That's refreshing, just like cold water. Verse 26, a righteous man falling down before the wicked is as a troubled fountain and a corrupt spring. This is talking about someone who has a reputation of being a righteous person, and they fall. And if that's done publicly, and if it's done in front of people who sort of look at them as, okay, yeah, they're the Christian on the block, and they're watching, and oh my goodness, that's a Christian? Well, that's like a troubled fountain. It's like a corrupt spring. Let's see, the Gaither Vocal Band released a song. It's probably been a decade ago. I can't keep up with time very well anymore, but they released a song called Muddy Water. And this song was, here's some words from it, some of the lyrics in the chorus. It says, "You can't quench your thirst drinking muddy water, or wash your soul in a dirty stream." And then it repeats, "You can't quench your thirst drinking muddy water. There's only one well where the water is clean." So they were talking about how chasing after things of the world will not satisfy your soul, will not cleanse your soul. And if you're chasing after those things and the world sees that in your life, they're going to see Christ through you, and they're going to think, "Oh my goodness, that's a corrupt spring. That's a troubled fountain. I don't need that. I can't drink that. That's not going to help me." So we need to be careful how we live in front of other people. The last two verses here are talking about self-control, and in the New Testament, that is usually termed as temperance, and being temperate. Being self-controlled in the things that we do. Verse 27 says,
It is not good to eat much honey. So for men to search their own glory is not glory. Last week we talked about the verse that we ended in last week was talking about honey. And I was talking a little bit about that with Itzy this morning. That honey is a wonderful food. As a matter of fact, it may be one of the most perfect foods that God ever designed. Honey will keep forever. And we've watched videos on honey. We've talked about honey and all the properties and the value of honey. And honey is good, and it tastes good, and it's great to put a little bit in your coffee or in your tea or whatever, or maybe in a dessert. Has anybody ever had baklava? You know what baklava is? Oh, that's wonderful. And one of the things in there is honey. It makes it really good. And so this verse, it says, it's not good to eat much honey. In other words, to not have self-control, to eat too much. And the verse that we talked about last week, it said, man, if you eat too much honey, you're going to vomit. You're going to puke. So do it in moderation. Have temperance. Have self-control. G. Campbell Morgan said, much honey produces nausea. So eventually does self-glorification. This verse says it's not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. All of the glory that we should be looking at is the glory in Christ, and we should not try to lift ourselves up. And then finally, verse 28, another verse about temperance and self-control says, he that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. No self-control. There are many who have so little self-control that can be said that they have no rule over their own spirit. The world, the flesh, or the devil rule over such people, and not the spirit of self-control that is part of the fruit of the Spirit. A city broken down, a city without walls, has no defense and is vulnerable to every attack. It has no security, stability, and can protect nothing really valuable. This shows some of the terrible costs of having no rule over one's own spirit. So this chapter ends with this conversation about how important it is for us to practice self-control. And I guarantee all of us struggle in some area of our life with self-control. I mean, it's difficult not to, but that's something that we need to work on and to develop self-control in our lives. All right. Anyone have a question, a comment?